Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this next session of the fourth annual Global Climate Restoration Forum, which is titled GGR is the New CDR, Methane and Climate Restoration. In case you're not familiar with those acronyms, GGR stands for Greenhouse Gas Removal, and CDR stands for Carbon Dioxide Removal. I'm joined today by four panelists to talk about different aspects of methane's contributions to the climate crisis and the importance and challenges of developing solutions for methane removal. So first, we're going to hear from Ken Alex. Ken is Director of Project Climate at Berkeley Law's Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. Ken spent 8 years as a senior policy advisor to Governor Jerry Brown in California, the director of the governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the chair of the Strategic Growth Council, focusing on climate, environment, and land use issues. Ken has a long career serving in many different ways to protect and improve the climate. Ken, really happy to have you here today. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here. And we're covering today one of my favorite topics, which is methane. Methane is sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of greenhouse gases, even though it's incredibly important. And so I have about 10 minutes to talk to you about why it's so important and why it presents truly probably the best opportunity in the medium to short term to take action that will be meaningful to reduce climate impacts. So usually, as we know, the greenhouse gas that gets the most attention is CO2. But it turns out that methane is almost as important for the 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming that so far we've impacted the planet from human endeavors. About 0.5 degrees, about 40 to 45% is the result of methane. The reason for that is methane over a 20-year period is over 80 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2. But there's some good news here because it creates an incredible opportunity. Methane lasts in the environment something like 12 or 15 years, whereas CO2 lasts 100 years or more. So any CO2 we put into the atmosphere today, it's going to be around for the rest of our lifetimes and beyond. But if we stop emitting methane, that methane will be out of the atmosphere and will actually create some more space and potentially give us some additional time. And could be as much as over the next 15 years or so, if we start to reduce methane significantly, might give us about 0.3 degrees of cooling. So that's quite significant. The other thing to mention here is that methane is, unlike CO2, is primarily the result of four sectors: oil and gas, coal, agriculture, and landfill and other forms of waste. Interestingly enough, agriculture is the largest of those. It's not necessarily easy to get methane out of that system, but it's not impossible either, and probably somewhat more straightforward in part than CO2. So in the oil and gas sector, for example, we know how to do it, and methane, of course, is the primary constituent of natural gas, which means if you capture methane, you can use it immediately as a product. And the oil and gas industry knows how to capture and control methane, but they have not been sufficiently incentivized either in terms of benefits or in terms of restrictions, although that's going to change in part, as you'll probably hear a little later today. The estimate is that by 2030, we should be able to reduce methane in the oil and gas sector by a very significant amount. And that will move us in the direction that we need to go. In the agriculture sector, the largest sector, as I noted, the biggest source of emission actually is livestock. And within that, something called enteric emissions, which are the emissions from the front of the cow. Manure is a smaller percentage. We've made more progress in figuring out how to reduce manure emissions, but enteric emissions are also being dealt with in some interesting ways, most notably through changing diets and feed additives for livestock. Red seaweed is one of the potential sources of reduction of methane emissions for cattle. Some very interesting research going on there. In the waste sector, most of those emissions come from landfills as organic material degrades. So the most obvious strategy there is to reduce and divert organic material from going to landfills. But then there are some actions that can be taken at existing landfills to reduce methane emissions, including things like biocovers, which are much less expensive than a full cap, which is also an approach that captures the methane and then reuses it. And so there are real potential ways to move forward quickly. And interestingly enough, in the last year, methane and methane action has become a much bigger focus worldwide. The United States and the European Union promoted and created something called the Global Methane Pledge that 120 countries have now signed. And that pledge includes a reduction goal of 30% of methane emissions by the year 2030. So pretty quick action. And now what we need to do is to figure out exactly how to make those actions meaningful and to do them in a quick fashion. If we can do so, we will create space in the atmosphere in 10 or 15 years that will allow us some additional time to take more action for the rest of the climate challenge. So this is really an important, it's one of the most important sets of actions that we can take. And the world is finally waking up to this opportunity. So it's terrific that this panel is going forward. And I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and exactly actions that can be taken to make this happen. Rick?
Thanks so much, Ken. I just want to mention for those of you in the audience who want to stay up to date on what Ken and his associates are paying attention to around methane, you can sign up for the Methane Minute newsletter on the website of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. So next, we'll hear from Daphne Weisham. Daphne is CEO of Methane Action, whose mission is to pursue the science and policy advances needed under careful global governance to rapidly restore atmospheric concentrations of methane to pre-industrial levels, about 700 parts per billion, for the benefit of present and future generations. For 20 years, Daphne was a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she founded and directed their climate justice program and served on the executive committee of the board of directors. Daphne, thank you so much for being here today. Over to you.
Thank you, Rick, and the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and thanks to Ken Alex for his presentation and everyone on this call for participating in the forum. My name is Daphne Weisham, and I am the CEO of Methane Action. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded about 2 years ago by a team of scientists and activists and philanthropists who recognized that we were facing a methane emergency and that we needed to respond accordingly. As Rick has already stated what what Methane Action's mission is, I won't go over that again, but we believe that if we succeed in our mission, that our scientific advisors tell us we can shave peak temperatures significantly by between 0.4 degrees and 1 degrees Celsius in the coming decades. We see this as a very hopeful first step down the path towards climate restoration. Methane Action is not just our organization's name, it's also our mission. And what we mean by Methane Action is both cutting methane emissions wherever we can and where we can't, taking action to remediate those emissions we can't avoid using methane removal technologies. This is an action agenda that will help to significantly restore the climate. The alternative, which is unthinkable, is inaction on methane, and that could put our climate targets and timetables, including keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, out of reach. We know atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide are at record levels at roughly 420 parts per million and rising, and methane concentrations are rising as well. They are twice pre-industrial levels and higher than at any time for which we have ice core records, which is about 800,000 years. What few understood until quite recently is that methane levels are rising twice as fast as CO2, and furthermore, their largest rise on record happened during the pandemic in 2021. Methane has caused at least a third of global warming and contributes about half the warming of CO2. Those proportions are likely to rise as the planet warms unless we take methane action. So as Ken mentioned, the world community began to wake up to the methane emergency last year when the Global Methane Pledge was announced in Glasgow, when over 120 countries joined and promised to cut anthropogenic methane emissions by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. This is, of course, an indispensable first step, and we fully support it. But we also recognize that given the current rise in methane from natural and man-made sources, both aggressive cuts in methane emissions and removal of emitted methane from the atmosphere will be required if we are to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. 40% of all methane that is now in the atmosphere comes from natural sources like wetlands and melting permafrost and lakes and even termites. And while scientists are not sure the reason, it appears that these natural sources of methane are rising as the planet warms. Scientists are also warning about the possibility of a methane feedback loop wherein more warming is leading to more methane being released from natural sources. And larger methane releases, of course, accelerate more warming, which leads to more methane releases, and so on. And while the emissions from methane sources are increasing, methane sinks are also declining. Naturally occurring hydroxyl and chlorine radicals in the atmosphere act as natural detergents, oxidizing methane in the atmosphere and breaking it down into CO2 and water vapor. But this natural methane sink is getting overwhelmed. The radicals are getting depleted by high methane emissions and other influences like smoke from forest fires. So they can't sufficiently cleanse the methane from the atmosphere, so that methane concentrations keep rising and cause more warming. And this is where methane removal comes in. Let me just clarify that when we say methane removal, we mean simply accelerating the natural destruction of methane in the atmosphere that has already been emitted in scientifically proven and environmentally sound, safe, and sustainable ways. Methane removal is different from carbon dioxide removal in that it requires no sequestration to keep it from re-entering the atmosphere. The methane simply gets oxidized and transformed into CO2 and water vapor. And of course, this happens naturally without methane removal, but not fast enough to deal with the current and future methane emissions that are at record levels. Methane removal enhances natural oxidation of methane, speeding up the timeline so it isn't overwhelmed by higher methane emissions. And then methane concentrations in the atmosphere can fall. One model of what methane removal could look like, you'll be hearing about from our scientific advisor, Dr. Renaud de Richter, and it involves solar chimneys. Other modes of methane removal involve zeolites or clay and are combined with lattices and direct air capture machines. You can see a suite of options that we think are promising on our website. And there's a link there in the box, methaneaction.org/technical. The entire field of methane removal is so new that new discoveries may in fact emerge as R&D funding becomes available. So just to recapitulate, why do we need methane removal and why won't cutting methane emissions alone suffice? First of all, not all anthropogenic emissions of methane are susceptible to remediation. There is a lot that can and must be done, as was stated earlier, around the fossil fuel sector. And of course, agriculture is the largest source of methane emissions, and a lot must be done there as well. However, even for agricultural methane emissions, it's going to be impossible to get to zero. Secondly, not every country has signed the Global Methane Pledge. In fact, some of the biggest emitters have not: Russia, China, and India, among others. And until these major methane emitting countries aggressively tackle their methane emissions, it will be very difficult to meet the pledge target of cutting global methane emissions by 30% globally by 2030. And even if we all of the world's countries did meet that pledge, it still won't prevent us from exceeding the Paris goal of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So third, as mentioned above, some 40% of methane comes from natural sources, and these emissions are rising as the planet warms. And in order to deal with not only these rising natural sources of methane, but also the risk of an as yet hard to quantify risk of methane feedback loops spinning out of control, we need to research and develop methane removal technologies starting now. Remember, if we act on the methane emergency by both cutting methane and removing methane from the atmosphere, scientists estimate we can actually shave peak temperatures by between 0.4 and 1 degree Celsius in the coming decades. Think of where we are now at 1.1 or 1.2 degrees and what the world would look like at 1.8 degrees. And compare that to where we were when warming was only half a degree Celsius. The promise of taking methane action is that it could make a major contribution toward getting us back to that state in a matter of decades, so that other forms of decarbonization and carbon dioxide removal have time to work. This could make all the difference in our ability to save countless lives and ecosystems. And in addition to being a powerful greenhouse gas, methane is a precursor to other pollutants like ground level ozone, which reduces crop yields and causes asthma, lung damage, and other health problems. So reducing atmospheric methane levels would have the important co-benefits of higher crop yields and improving human health. Promising methane removal research is emerging now, and we need more funding to get the technology ready for testing and deployment. We know where to go, we know where we need to go, which is out of the danger zone and back down to safe levels of methane in the atmosphere. We just need to ramp up the R&D funding and put these brilliant scientists to work. Now, methane removal is not a magic bullet, but it is one powerful tool in our toolbox that we believe we must invest in now for present and future generations. So the next steps, in addition to the R&D funding that's needed, we need to spread awareness about the nature of the methane emergency that we are in, engage governments, civil society in a dialogue around governance of methane removal, which you will be hearing more about from our legal advisor, John Fitzgerald. And finally, let me say that for methane action to succeed, we need to earn social license. So it is essential that we work with stakeholders to center equity, justice, and good governance around methane mitigation and removal on the path to climate restoration. We are eager to partner with groups that can help us to do this. So please send an email to info@methaneaction.org or sign up on our website and let us know how we can partner with you. We can't do this work alone. So thank you for being part of this webinar, and I will now turn it back to Rick Wayman. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daphne. I'd now like to introduce Renaud de Richter, a scientific advisor to Methane Action. He graduated from the Organic Chemistry Department of the Engineering School of Chemistry in Montpellier, France, with a master's degree in chemistry. His PhD thesis was on organoborane asymmetric synthesis. Renaud received his PhD in 1989 from University of Science and Technology in Montpellier, France. His current research interests include the application of photocatalytic chemistry and processes for environmental protection to fight climate change and for remediation purposes. Renaud, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rick, for this kind of introduction, and thank you to the previous panelists, and thank you to everybody present for joining for this presentation. I will talk to you about, I will give you an overview of the methods for atmospheric marine methane removal. I need to share my screen, please. I will not repeat what already Rick said, Ken said, sorry, but methane is very important because it makes nearly 1/3 of the current global warming, as showed by the IPCC last report. And also, the largest atmospheric methane growth occurred the last 2 years. So we think we are in a methane emergency and we need to deal with methane quickly. There are some bad news, but later on we will see some good news. Among the bad news is that the atmospheric concentration of methane is rising faster and faster because the natural elimination processes are insufficient. Another bad news is that the oxidative capacity of the atmosphere will decline when we will get rid of the use of fossil fuels. And last but not least, the biogenic emissions of methane are growing, in particular from tropical wetlands. And man-made global warming will further increase them. So we cannot call anymore natural emissions the emissions from wetlands because they are increasing due to anthropogenic global warming. The good news and the reasons for hope is that the global methane pledge has been signed last year at the COP26, and they target to reduce by 30% the anthropogenic emissions, and more than 100 countries already signed it. There are also several promising methane removal methods which can deal with the reduction of the oxidative capacity of the atmosphere in the near future. So that means that the warming feedback loop due to methane can be prevented. We can get prepared also to a possible methane burst. Methane removal is complementary with aggressive mitigation methods. And if using both removal and remediation, if we succeed bringing back methane to pre-industrial levels, that means that we can have a temperature shave of 1.1 degree Fahrenheit. In the atmosphere, the overall reaction that naturally occurs with methane is an oxidation. That means that methane is oxidized into carbon dioxide and water. Of course, the chemical reactions occurring are much more numerous and complex, but the overall reaction is that one molecule of methane is oxidized into one molecule of carbon dioxide. And that gives very good benefits for climate. As Ken said, the global warming potential of methane is over 80 times higher than the one of carbon dioxide. And our goal is only to speed up the natural oxidation processes. Methane is naturally removed by hydroxyl radicals, which remove about 90% of the methane in the atmosphere. Also by chlorine radicals, which remove about 2 or 4% of the methane, and by methane-consuming microorganisms named methanotrophs, which are on plants, on trees, surfaces, and soils, which remove the late 3-6%. So the scientific peer review articles emphasize on nature-based methods which enhance the natural sinks of methane directly in the troposphere where wind and natural diffusion takes place. There are also nature-based methods which enhance methane-consuming microbes and other ways in which methane-producing microbes are inhibited. And of course, after that, there are more technical and technological methods that speed up the natural oxidation of methane, for instance, with catalysts. But there are challenges for those technical solutions because the concentration of methane in the atmosphere is very low, only about 2 parts per million. So roofs, windmills, car, planes, and surfaces exposed to large volumes of air will need to be coated with those catalysts. Or we can use also efficient air-moving devices driving methane through the catalysts. Among those air-moving devices that can process large volumes of air, the direct air capture devices have been seeded. And we think that methane removal can be combined with this future DAC infrastructure with little additional cost and energy consumption. Or we can develop synergies with solar updraft chimneys, which can produce heat, which can produce airflow, and which can produce renewable energy. Here's one example of an existing air purification system. It is a solar chimney. This prototype was built 4 years ago in China, and it is devoted to remove particulate matter. And it's only devoted to do that, to remove particles. But this prototype is based on work carried out at the University of Minnesota only 3 years earlier. So we know that the Chinese can go very fast. So the picture I show you is just a prototype, but there are several methane removal possibilities using the full-scale tower because the final system proposed will be able to remediate more than 22 cubic kilometers of polluted air per day. That means that based on this model, we can build one full-scale device adapted to transform methane into carbon dioxide, and the system can process more than 11,000 tons of methane per year, which is more or less 1 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. There are also many co-benefits to removing methane, and the next slide was borrowed to the Climate and Clean Air Coalition work, which published last year the Global Methane Assessment, with the United Nations. Reducing anthropogenic methane emissions by 45%, which is more than the target of the global methane pledge, will avoid additional warming up to 0.3 degrees Celsius. And this also will prevent additional death of 250,000 people. And this will also prevent the loss of 26 million tons of crops. So there are many, many different co-benefits to reducing methane. The work by the Climate and Clean Air Coalition also gave us diagrams with the methane levels consistent with the Paris target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as you see, we need to reduce the current atmospheric concentration of methane. The global methane pledge will only stabilize the concentration of methane in the atmosphere. So we need to go further and reduce this concentration of methane. As a conclusion, I will say that the methane action removal aims are restoring pre-industrial levels of methane, reducing global warming, and keeping the chances for limiting global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius in complement to all long-term climate change mitigation efforts, and in particular to methane mitigation. And of course, funding is needed for methane removal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Renaud. And finally, I would like to introduce John Fitzgerald, who coordinates the legal and governmental strategy for methane action. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, John worked in Congress as a legislative aide to help strengthen the Superfund and staff the Congressional Solar Energy Caucus. Since then, he has gone on to many other focuses within the environment and policy very effectively. He's won awards from the American Bar Association, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, the Endangered Species Coalition, the Northfield Mount Herman School, among many others. John, over to you.
Thank you, Rick. Can you hear me now? Very good. What we're going to do is look at the methane removal possibilities, as Renaud has outlined them for us in a scientific manner, through the global policy lens, then the domestic policy lens, and then state and local. We want to make sure these things fit and support each other. So let's first start with the methane pledge. Now, if you read the methane pledge, you'll see that very quickly after the basic goal is stated, it then commits each pledging nation to adopt domestic measures. That means basically regulations and incentives to accomplish the goal. Those regulations can be enforceable, and those regulations can also form the basis for trade measures to make sure that nations who are not doing as good a job can perhaps have their good tariffed or maybe even embargoed, so as to not undercut the nations that are doing what they're supposed to do. This is fairly established international law since the shrimp and sea turtle appellate decisions of the early 1990s. That allows us to make international trade supportive of environmental conservation and restoration. So with that in mind, we have the hope of 120 nations or more, close to 130 now, of having different measures that are actually legally binding on their own citizens and on those with whom they trade. That's a key. At Methane Action, we've basically posted a draft methane declaration, which is a form of international agreement that has the teeth that it may carry depending on the body of the document. In other words, it's very flexible. We've drafted a fairly simple idea that could be adopted at any point by any number of nations. But what it basically does is commit us to sharing the results of research in the different areas that Renaud mentioned, basically 4 main areas of removing methane, and then preparing to deploy those after we assess their environmental impacts and make sure we can control those, and then do careful field tests under the guidance issued by the International Maritime Organization, that is the London Convention on Pollution of the Seas, if we use an ocean-based method, and by the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has issued some guidance as well. I will note here that the Convention on Biological Diversity has core principles that are perfectly appropriate for methane removal. They include the duty of nations not to harm the environment of other nations in Article 3, the duty of nations to assess the impact of their actions, and in Article 14.2, to pay for the restoration of environments that are harmed by their actions or those actions of those they control, as the jurisdiction is set out in Article 5. And finally, in Article 8, there is a duty to restore degraded ecosystems. That is exactly what we're talking about here. It's a degraded ecosystem of the climate, as it affects many different areas. And in some areas, the air pollution is worse than in other areas. But that's all degraded. We're about restoring that to a healthy, livable environment. And so we understand these principles are powerful and we want to apply those. Let's see how we can do that domestically. Domestically, we already have the Clean Air Act. And although the Supreme Court said it has to be carefully delegated from Congress to the agencies, EPA, to do the things under the Clean Air Act that Congress has asked them to do, we have now seen the Congress say, we mean it. Greenhouse gases are pollutants under the Clean Air Act. And so the Congress has essentially directed EPA to go forth and adopt the ambient air quality standards and adopt emission standards to deal with greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. Congress has not touched another very powerful tool, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act. And in 2016, that act was substantially revised and upgraded in the Lautenberg amendments, so that now, if the EPA determines that any substance put into commerce presents an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment, those who put that substance into commerce can be required to pay for means of withdrawing it, reclaiming it, removing it, and deploying those means. Jim Hansen, our most famous climate scientist, and his policy director and advisor have petitioned the EPA on June 16th to do just that for fossil fuels and the results of use of fossil fuels, that is carbon dioxide and methane primarily, but all the other greenhouse gases that are attendant to the use of fossil fuels in their production and transportation. The EPA, as you may know, has been undergoing a process of developing oil and gas regulations, and these regulations will be a core part of that. But it needn't stop there. And so that petition can require fossil fuel emitters to bear the initial burden of paying for the development of these restoration and removal methods. So that's a powerful tool, and the Congress did not address that one way or the other. And therefore, you can't generally say they preempted things by essentially strengthening the Clean Air Act as well. So you have those two major tools. And then we have the rest of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very powerful panoply of arrangements, directions, and funds, mostly carrots, a few sticks, such as methane fees, but the carrots are remarkable. And when you ask on the web, when you look for different summaries of that act and its climate provisions, you will actually not find the most powerful information. You have to read the statute. And I have to tell you that my law professor for legislation said the British thought the Americans did it backwards. They would read the debates, they would read the committee reports, and when they couldn't figure it out, they'd finally read the statute. So we have to read the statute. And what's wonderful about that is that at numerous places in the IRA, we have very strong language. We have 3 or 4 different methods under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, wherein they're given funds to support various means of coming at the reduction, capturing, avoiding, or sequestering carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide emissions associated with agricultural practices, whether it be livestock or land use or other kinds of things, which might include, for instance, rice production. Those phrases, capture, avoid, or sequester carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, are repeated over and over again in the agricultural section, and similarly comprehensive language is found in the sections giving grants through EPA to overburdened frontline communities, and other means of approaching methane. So the point is, the Congress has, in explicit language, told us to remove methane. And indeed, this started a year ago or more, actually in June of 2021, with the methane fee and the devotion of 75% of that in the original texts for the reconciliation bill to the addressing of legacy pollution from oil and gas production and transmission. Legacy pollution from that activity is largely methane. And so what they're talking about, if you read the statutory language, is removing methane in all the ways that Renaud has outlined for us. And it's a remarkable breakthrough that we have incredible amounts of money, frankly, for agencies and also for states and localities to apply, and even citizens groups in some of these programs can apply for funds to do just that. And I have to tell you that this is a rather remarkable piece of legislation. For instance, Section 60.111, Greenhouse Gas Corporate Reporting, tells us to, not us, but basically says to the EPA, you're going to find a way to improve corporate reporting. It also tells the EPA to figure out a way to look at the Scope 3 emissions all the way through the whole production and use process of different products. And that sets us up to do a fair and justifiable set of trade measures to make this a global standard. We are the biggest trading country in the world, and the EU is basically second or third. So together we can do the kind of things that I know has outlined we need to do by funding themselves and making sure our trade is based on a restorative economy and not a depleting economy. I'm going to stop fairly soon here, but I have to tell you that if you go ahead and read the statute, it's only 730 pages long, but you can go through the sections that are important through the guidance of other publications and find that there's a lot here that can be done. So I'd like to pretty soon note that California, Washington, New York State have all got very, very innovative programs underway, oftentimes led by localities who are saying, wait a minute, we're not going to do more infrastructure here for oil and gas. We don't need any more. It's dangerous. It leaks methane, and it's bad for our local health through the leaking of methane, which makes ground level ozone. We get rid of that. We get rid of some ground level ozone. We improve our health. That's what I know pointed out. So we can have leadership at the state and local level, as well as the federal level, and then help the whole world to heal itself. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you to all of our panelists for your enlightening and interesting presentations. I hope that our audience members will walk away with new energy to focus on methane removal as a key part of climate restoration. Before we wrap up this panel, I would like to remind our audience that we'll have a 1-hour workshop on methane removal tomorrow with Daphne and John. I hope that you can join us for that interactive workshop that will be very focused on discussion with all of you as participants. So thanks again to our fantastic panelists today and to all of you for joining us.